Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The envelope sealed in silence. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Hello and welcome to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and today I have the privilege of sharing with you one of the most perplexing cases that ever challenged the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot. It began on a grey November morning in 1923, when silence itself became the most damning evidence of all. Chapter 1: The Silent Witness. The fog hung thick over Westminster that Tuesday, wrapping the government buildings in a shroud of mystery that seemed oddly fitting for what was to unfold. Inside the colonial office, the clerks had already settled into their morning routines when young Timothy Ashford made his discovery. Poirot would later describe the scene with his characteristic precision: a modest office on the third floor, lined with filing cabinets and dominated by a heavy oak desk. Behind that desk sat Mr. Edmund Hartwell, 43 years of age, a career civil servant who had served His Majesty's government faithfully for over 2 decades. At first glance he appeared to be sleeping, his head resting peacefully on his crossed arms, but Timothy knew better. The unnatural stillness, the pale complexion, the absence of breath, all spoke of death's quiet visitation. What caught everyone's attention, however, was not the deceased gentleman himself, but what he clutched in his right hand, a cream-coloured envelope, sealed but bearing no address. When the police surgeon carefully pried it from the dead man's fingers, they found it contained a single sheet of paper, completely blank. Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard arrived within the hour, a competent man who had worked several cases alongside our Belgian detective. He examined the scene methodically: no signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, no indication of violence. The office door had been locked from the inside, with Hartwell possessing the only key. The windows, 3 stories above the courtyard, remained securely fastened. Natural causes, most likely, Morrison pronounced after his initial inspection. Perhaps his heart gave out. These government types worked themselves to death, you know, but something troubled him about that envelope. Why would a dying man clutch such a thing? And why was the paper inside completely blank? Dr. Pemberton, the police surgeon, completed his preliminary examination. No obvious cause of death, he reported. Will need a proper autopsy, but I see no signs of violence or poison. Could well be cardiac arrest, though he seems rather young for it. Morrison questioned the staff. Hartwell had arrived at his usual time, 8 o'clock sharp. His secretary, Miss Eleanor Whitfield, had spoken with him briefly about the day's correspondence. He had seemed in good health and spirits, perhaps even more cheerful than usual. He had specifically requested not to be disturbed until lunchtime, claiming he had important work to complete. When Miss Whitfield returned at 1 o'clock with his customary cup of tea, she found the door locked. Her knocking received no response. Only when Timothy Ashford brought a spare key from the building manager did they discover the tragic scene. The mystery of the blank envelope might have remained unsolved, relegated to the category of deathbed oddities, had it not been for what occurred 2 days later. Monsieur Georges Dubois, first secretary at the French embassy, arrived at his Belgravia residence Thursday evening to find his butler waiting with obvious concern. "A most peculiar delivery, sir," the man reported. "No messenger, simply placed in the post slot. But it bears your name, written by hand." The envelope was identical to the one found with Hartwell, same cream paper, same quality, same size. Inside again, a single blank sheet. Dubois was no fool. The newspapers had reported Hartwell's death, though they had discreetly omitted mention of the mysterious envelope. But a diplomat learns to read between lines, and Dubois recognized a pattern when he saw one. Within an hour, he was at Scotland Yard, demanding to speak with Inspector Morrison. "Gentlemen," Morrison said to his assembled team the following morning, "we appear to have a case that requires specialized attention. I propose we consult Monsieur Hercule Poirot." And so it was that on a crisp Friday morning, Poirot found himself in Morrison's office, examining 2 identical envelopes containing 2 identical blank sheets of paper. His green eyes sparkled with interest as he studied them through his magnifying glass. "Fascinating," he murmured. 2 envelopes, 2 blank papers, and yet they speak volumes. The question, mon ami, is whether we are clever enough to listen to their silence. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Corridors. Poirot's first action was characteristically methodical. He requested a complete dossier on Edmund Hartwell, studying the man's life with the thoroughness of a scholar, examining an ancient manuscript. What emerged was the portrait of a remarkably unremarkable individual. Hartwell had been born in Somerset, the son of a country vicar. He had attended Oxford on scholarship, graduating with modest honours in classics. His entry into the civil service had been routine, his advancement steady but unspectacular. He lived alone in a small flat in Bloomsbury, kept regular hours, and had no known vices beyond an occasional game of whist at his club. A man who lived in the shadows, Poirot observed to Inspector Morrison, but even shadows can hide secrets, n'est-ce pas? The autopsy results arrived Monday morning, adding another layer to the mystery. Dr. Pemberton's full examination revealed no natural cause of death. Hartwell's heart was sound, his organs healthy, his blood free of poison, yet he was undeniably dead. Impossible, Morrison muttered, studying the report. A man doesn't simply stop living without cause. Au contraire, Poirot replied quietly. A man can die of many things that leave no trace. Fear perhaps, or shock, or the weight of knowledge too terrible to bear. Their investigation of Hartwell's office yielded surprising results. Miss Whitfield, his secretary, proved to be a treasure trove of information, though she seemed unaware of her knowledge's significance. Hartwell had been different these past few weeks, she confided to Poirot during their interview in the colonial office. More watchful, I suppose. He would study people's faces when they spoke, as if searching for something hidden beneath their words. And his work, had it changed in any way? Not dramatically, but he had begun staying late more frequently. Sometimes I would see his light burning well past 7 o'clock. When I asked if he needed assistance, he would simply smile and say he was tidying up loose ends. Poirot learned that Hartwell's responsibilities included processing correspondence related to colonial trade agreements. Not the most glamorous work, but it involved access to sensitive commercial and political information. A man in such a position might well encounter secrets worth killing for. The interview with Monsieur Dubois proved equally illuminating. The French diplomat was a sophisticated man in his 50s, elegant and articulate, but clearly disturbed by recent events. "I must ask you, Monsieur Poirot," Dubois said, as they sat in his embassy office, "do you believe someone wishes me dead?" "That depends, monsieur, upon what connection you might have had with the late Mr. Hartwell." Dubois hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk. "I knew him only slightly. We had encountered each other at various government functions. He seemed a pleasant enough fellow, though hardly the sort to move in diplomatic circles. And yet," Poirot observed gently, "someone thought it important to send you the same type of envelope that was found with his body. Precisely what troubles me. What could a minor colonial office clerk and I possibly have in common that would interest whoever is behind this?" Poirot studied the diplomat carefully. Despite his polished exterior, Dubois exhibited the telltale signs of a man under strain, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the careful precision of his words. "Tell me, monsieur, have you noticed anything unusual recently? Changes in routine perhaps? New faces in familiar places, now that you mention it?" Dubois paused, then continued slowly. "There have been several instances in recent weeks where I felt I was being observed. Nothing overt, you understand, just the sensation of eyes upon me. I dismissed it as paranoia, but now you wonder if your instincts were correct." That evening, Poirot and Inspector Morrison reviewed their findings in Morrison's office. The pieces of the puzzle lay before them like fragments of a broken mirror, each reflecting a different aspect of the truth, but none revealing the complete picture. "We have a dead civil servant with no apparent cause of death," Morrison summarized. "A mysterious envelope containing nothing but blank paper. A French diplomat who received an identical envelope and fears for his life, and no apparent connection between the two men." "Ah, but there must be a connection," Poirot insisted. "The blank papers are not random. They are a message, as clear as any written words to those who understand their meaning." "But what do they mean?" Poirot smiled enigmatically. "That, mon ami, is what we must discover. But I suspect that before we do, our mysterious correspondent will make contact again." The question is, who will be next to receive their silent message? Chapter 3. The language of secrets. Tuesday morning brought disturbing news. Mrs. Helena Fairchild, widow of a prominent member of Parliament, contacted Scotland Yard in a state of considerable agitation. She had arrived home the previous evening to find an envelope waiting for her, delivered by unknown means. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. Cream-coloured envelope, her name written in the same careful script, and inside the now familiar blank sheet of paper. Poirot accompanied Inspector Morrison to Mrs. Fairchild's residence in Kensington, a stately Georgian house that spoke of old money and older secrets. Mrs. Fairchild herself was a handsome woman in her late 40s, possessed of the kind of dignified bearing that comes from years in political society. "I must confess, gentlemen," she said as they sat in her elegant drawing-room, "this business has me thoroughly unnerved. My late husband was involved in matters of considerable sensitivity. I fear someone may be attempting to extract information from me." "What sort of information, madame?" Poirot inquired gently. Mrs. Fairchild's composure faltered slightly. Charles was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He dealt with classified materials, diplomatic correspondence, matters of national importance. After his death last year, I inherited his papers. Perhaps someone believes I possess documents they desire. And do you? She hesitated, then seemed to gather her resolve. "There are certain papers, yes. Charles made me promise to keep them safe, to never allow them to fall into the wrong hands, but I don't even know what they contain. He sealed them away before his illness, instructing me never to open them unless someone came asking the right questions." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "The right questions, madame." He was quite specific. He said that if anyone ever mentioned the Bengal matter or spoke of exports that never arrived, I should know they were legitimate inquiries. But no one has ever asked such questions. Inspector Morrison exchanged glances with Poirot. The mention of Bengal caught their attention immediately. Hartwell's work at the Colonial Office dealt extensively with Indian trade matters. After leaving Mrs. Fairchild's residence, Poirot insisted on visiting Hartwell's flat in Bloomsbury. The modest apartment revealed little at first glance, neat, organized, the home of a man of simple tastes and regular habits. But Poirot's examination was anything but superficial. "Observe, mon ami," he said to Morrison, pointing to Hartwell's small writing desk. "The blotting paper, she is clean. Too clean for a man who worked with correspondence daily. And see here." He indicated faint impressions on the desk's leather surface. "Something heavy was placed here recently, and then removed." In the bedroom, Poirot discovered something more significant, a small wall safe, hidden behind a watercolor painting. It stood open and empty. "Recently opened," Poirot noted, examining the mechanism, "and not by force. Someone possessed the combination." Their investigation of Hartwell's background revealed an interesting detail that had been overlooked initially. During his early years at the Colonial Office, he had served briefly in India, working in the Calcutta office from 1919 to 1921. His responsibilities had included oversight of export documentation for the Bengal region. "Bengal again," Morrison observed. "That can't be coincidence." "Indeed not, and I begin to see the shape of this mystery, though not yet its complete form." That evening, Poirot received an unexpected visitor at his lodgings. Miss Whitfield, Hartwell's secretary, arrived looking pale and frightened. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, accepting his offer of tea with trembling hands, "but I've remembered something that might be important. Please, mademoiselle, tell me everything. 3 weeks before he died, Mr. Hartwell asked me to help him with a most unusual task. He wanted me to research the current addresses of several individuals, people he claimed to have known in India. I found it odd because he rarely spoke of his time there. Do you remember any of these names?" "One was Mrs. Fairchild. I recognized her because of her late husband's prominence. Another was Monsieur Dubois at the French embassy. There were others, but I can't recall them all." Poirot set down his teacup with deliberate care. "Most interesting. Did he explain why he needed this information?" "He said he was planning a reunion of sorts, old colleagues who had shared experiences in India, but he seemed nervous about it, not excited as one might expect when planning a pleasant gathering." "And did he contact these people?" I don't know. He handled all such correspondence personally after that. But, she hesitated. Yes, the day before he died, he asked me to witness his signature on several documents. He wouldn't let me read them, but they appeared to be letters. He sealed them in envelopes but didn't address them in my presence. As Miss Whitfield departed, Poirot sat in contemplation. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. One thing was becoming clear. Edmund Hartwell had not been the simple civil servant he appeared to be. He had possessed knowledge dangerous enough to kill for, and secrets that reached across continents and decades. Chapter 4. Shadows from the East. Wednesday morning found Poirot in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by bound volumes of old newspapers and government publications. His research into the Bengal matter had led him to search for any unusual incidents involving exports from that region during Hartwell's tenure in India. What he discovered was illuminating. In March 1921, just months before Hartwell's return to London, there had been a significant scandal involving missing shipments of precious gems intended for the London market. The official investigation had concluded that the shipments had been lost to bandits, but several newspaper reports hinted at suspicions of corruption within the colonial administration itself. The investigation had been quietly dropped when key witnesses disappeared or refused to testify. Among the officials questioned was one Edmund Hartwell, though his name appeared in only the smallest print of the most obscure reports. Most curious, Poirot murmured to himself as he studied these accounts, a scandal that vanished as completely as the gems themselves. His afternoon was spent at the French embassy, where Monsieur Dubois had agreed to see him again. This time Poirot approached the diplomat with more pointed questions. Monsieur Dubois, I believe the time for discretion has passed. Were you in India between 1919 and 1922? The Frenchman's composure cracked visibly. Yes, but only briefly. I was attached to the French commercial mission in Calcutta for 18 months, and your duties there, trade negotiations, primarily. Franco-British commercial agreements regarding various exports, tea, jute, precious stones. Ah, precious stones, most interesting. And did you encounter Mr. Hartwell during this period? Dubois stood and walked to his window, staring out at the London street below. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, I knew Hartwell. We worked together on several occasions, processing export documentation. He was thorough in his work, perhaps too thorough. In what way? He asked questions, many questions, about discrepancies in shipping manifests, about gem classifications that didn't match their described values, about why certain shipments seemed to evaporate between Calcutta and London. Poirot joined him at the window. And what did you tell him? The truth, that I had noticed the same irregularities, but had been instructed by my superiors to overlook them. The colonial administration was a complex machine, and sometimes small problems were best left unexamined in the interest of larger cooperation. But Mr. Hartwell was not satisfied with this explanation. He continued his investigations, quietly, carefully, but persistently. He began copying documents, making lists, building what he called a complete picture of the situation. That evening, Poirot received another visitor, Mrs. Fairchild, arriving unannounced and clearly distressed. I've been thinking about what you said, she began without preamble, about my husband's papers. I believe I should examine them regardless of his instructions. They retired to her late husband's study, where Mrs. Fairchild opened a substantial safe concealed behind a bookshelf. Inside were several folders, marked with dates from the early 1920s. The documents they contained were explosive. Charles Fairchild, it appeared, had been conducting his own investigation into corruption in the Indian colonial administration. His files contained correspondence with British officials in Calcutta, reports from gem dealers in London complaining of missing shipments, and most damaging of all, a detailed accounting of significant discrepancies between goods shipped from India and goods received in England. My God, Mrs. Fairchild whispered as they read. Charles suspected that someone was systematically stealing gems and replacing them with inferior stones, then claiming the shipments were lost to bandits. One folder was particularly significant. It contained copies of shipping manifests in Hartwell's handwriting, along with a note in Charles Fairchild's script. EH has agreed to provide additional documentation when he returns to London. His evidence could expose the entire conspiracy. But the most revealing document was a letter dated just weeks before Charles Fairchild's death from cancer. In it he wrote to an unnamed recipient, "I have decided to abandon this investigation. The consequences of exposure would destroy too many innocent people, and the guilty parties have covered their tracks too well. I will take this knowledge to my grave, but I have ensured that the evidence will be preserved should circumstances change. EH has agreed to maintain our mutual silence." Poirot studied this letter with particular attention. "Most illuminating, Madame. Your husband and Mr. Hartwell shared a dangerous secret, one that they had agreed to keep hidden. But why would someone kill for it now so long after the events?" Perhaps, Poirot suggested quietly, because someone discovered that their silence was no longer guaranteed. As they prepared to leave the study, Mrs. Fairchild noticed something that made her gasp. "The portrait," she said, pointing to an empty space on the wall where a painting had obviously hung. "My husband's portrait of his time in India. It's gone." The picture had hung there for years, she explained, a memento of Charles's brief service as a young diplomat in Calcutta. Someone had taken it, and recently, judging by the unfaded rectangle of wallpaper where it had hung. "What was depicted in this portrait, Madame?" Charles, standing with several other officials outside the government house in Calcutta. He was quite proud of it, said it captured an important moment in his career. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "A group photograph, showing faces, names, relationships. Such a thing could be quite valuable to someone seeking to identify all the participants in this old conspiracy." As they left the Fairchild residence, Poirot was convinced they were getting close to the truth. Someone was methodically working through a list of people who had known about the Bengal gem thefts, silencing them one by one. But the blank papers suggested something more subtle than simple murder. They were warnings, opportunities for cooperation before more direct action became necessary. The question now was who would be next to receive their silent message. Chapter 5: The Collector's Gambit. Thursday morning brought tragic confirmation of Poirot's fears. Inspector Morrison arrived at Poirot's lodgings with grim news. Monsieur Dubois had been found dead in his study at the French embassy, apparently of heart failure. On his desk lay another cream-colored envelope, this one containing not a blank sheet but a single word written in elegant script. "Mercy. Thank you," Poirot translated grimly. "Our correspondent expresses gratitude for Monsieur Dubois' compliance." "Compliance with what?" Morrison demanded. "With whatever demand was made of him." The blank pages were not threats, mon ami. They were invitations to cooperate. When recipients understood the message and complied, they received acknowledgment. When they refused, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Hartwell's clutched envelope had been blank because he had died before he could respond to the ultimatum it represented. The search of Dubois' office revealed that his personal safe had been emptied recently. According to his secretary, the diplomat had been working late for several nights, going through old files and documents. On his final evening, he had been observed carrying a substantial briefcase when he left the building. Whatever they wanted from him, Morrison observed, they got it. Poirot's investigation that afternoon took him to a most unexpected location, Mayfair's most exclusive gentlemen's club, the Meridian. Mrs. Fairchild had mentioned that her late husband had been a member, and Poirot suspected that the stolen photograph might have depicted other club members who had served in India. The club's secretary, a discreet elderly gentleman named Mr. Pembroke, was initially reluctant to discuss members' affairs. However, when Poirot explained the circumstances and mentioned the recent deaths, Pembroke's attitude changed dramatically. "Good heavens," the man whispered, leading Poirot to a private sitting room. "You don't suppose Charles's death was natural causes were confirmed in his case," Poirot assured him, "but his knowledge may have died with him only temporarily." Pembroke revealed that several Meridian members had served in India during the early 1920s. Besides Charles Fairchild, there was Sir Reginald Ashworth, a retired colonial administrator, and Colonel James Weatherby, who had commanded military escorts for valuable shipments. There was also Mr. Marcus Cornelius, Pembroke added hesitantly. "Though he's no longer a member, he was asked to resign several years ago under somewhat irregular circumstances." "What sort of circumstances?" "Financial irregularities, questions about his business dealings while in India."
Nothing was ever proven, you understand, but the committee felt his continued membership might prove embarrassing. Poirot's pulse quickened. And where might one find Mr. Cornelius now? He operates a small import business from offices in Cheapside. Cornelius and Associates, I believe, specializes in precious stones and oriental artifacts. The offices of Cornelius and Associates occupied the third floor of a narrow building in a less fashionable part of the city. Marcus Cornelius himself proved to be a thin, nervous man in his 50s, with the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors examining small, valuable objects. When Poirot presented himself and explained his interest in recent events, Cornelius became visibly agitated. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, fidgeting with a jeweler's loupe, "but I've had nothing to do with any deaths or mysterious envelopes." "I have not yet mentioned any envelopes, monsieur." Cornelius's face flushed. "Well, naturally I've heard the rumors. London's not that large a city, and certain circles talk." "What circles would those be?" "People who understand the value of discretion, who know that some old stories are better left buried." Poirot examined the man's shop with interest. Despite its modest location, it contained some extraordinarily valuable pieces: Indian rubies, Burmese sapphires, diamonds of exceptional quality, far more valuable than a small import business should reasonably possess. "You have excellent taste in gems, Monsieur Cornelius. Might I ask where you acquire such fine specimens?" "Various sources: estate sales, private collectors, dealers who prefer anonymity." "And have you had any recent contact with Mr. Edmund Hartwell, or perhaps Monsieur Dubois from the French embassy?" The effect of these names on Cornelius was electric. He stumbled backward, knocking over a display case, gems scattering across the floor like fallen stars. I haven't. Why would you ask such a thing?" But before Poirot could respond, a voice spoke from the shop's rear entrance. "Because, Monsieur Poirot, you are getting dangerously close to matters that don't concern you." The speaker was a woman, perhaps 60 years old, elegantly dressed but with eyes as hard as the gems scattered at their feet. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Lady Catherine Whitmore." She introduced herself with a slight bow. "I believe you've been asking questions about me, though you may not have realized it." Poirot studied her carefully. "I regret that I do not recall." "Oh, but you should. I was in India during the period that interests you so much. I was married then to Colonel Whitmore, who supervised gem shipments for the colonial administration. After his death in 1922, I returned to London and diversified my investments." She gestured around the shop. "Marcus here has been invaluable in helping me liquidate certain assets that I brought back from India. Assets that some people might question if they were inclined to ask awkward questions. And you ensure that such questions are not asked. I ensure that gentlemen like yourself understand the value of discretion. The blank papers you've been investigating so thoroughly, they were simply invitations to remember forgotten agreements. Mr. Hartwell and his friends had promised to keep certain matters private. I merely reminded them of their obligations, and if they refused to honor these obligations..." Lady Catherine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then they discovered that some debts can only be paid in full." As she spoke, Poirot noticed that Marcus Cornelius had quietly moved to block the shop's front entrance, while Lady Catherine controlled the rear. The situation was becoming decidedly uncomfortable. "You see, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Catherine continued, "some secrets are worth killing for, and some people are simply too dangerous to remain alive." Chapter 6: The Price of Knowledge. Lady Catherine Whitmore continued her exposition with the calm confidence of someone who believed she held all the advantages. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot, that what happened in India was simply a matter of redistribution. The colonial system was inherently unfair. We who served the empire risked our lives and fortunes, while the natives sat on treasures they barely understood. So you took it upon yourself to correct this injustice?" Poirot inquired, his voice carefully neutral. "My late husband and I, along with our associates, developed a rather elegant system. Genuine shipments would be intercepted en route, the finest gems removed and replaced with inferior stones. The bandit attacks provided perfect cover. Who questions losses to robbery in such dangerous territory?" Marcus Cornelius shifted nervously by the door. "Catherine, perhaps we shouldn't." "Nonsense, Marcus. Monsieur Poirot is a gentleman of intelligence. He appreciates the sophistication of our operation. She turned back to Poirot. We were quite successful for nearly 2 years. Millions of pounds worth of gems, properly redistributed to those who truly deserved them. And Mr. Hartwell discovered your activities.
Unfortunately, yes. That tedious little clerk with his obsessive attention to detail. He began noticing discrepancies, asking questions, making lists. Charles Fairchild became involved when London dealers started complaining about the quality of stones in their shipments. Lady Catherine moved to examine a particularly fine ruby in a display case, handling it with the familiarity of long acquaintance. We thought the matter was settled when my husband died, and the investigation was quietly dropped. Everyone agreed that discretion was preferable to scandal. But then, last month, I learned that Mr. Hartwell had been talking to certain people, suggesting that perhaps the time had come to revisit old questions. So you sent him a warning. I sent him an opportunity. The blank page was an invitation to remember his promise of silence. He need only acknowledge his continued cooperation, and the matter would remain closed. But he refused. He chose to be noble instead of sensible. Really, what did he hope to accomplish? The gems are long since sold, the trail thoroughly cold. His death would serve no purpose except to satisfy his conscience. Poirot noted that while Lady Catherine spoke, Marcus Cornelius was growing increasingly agitated. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool November air, and his hands trembled as he fumbled with the door lock. And Monsieur Dubois, what was his response to your invitation? Much more practical. He understood that some secrets are best left buried. His cooperation was acknowledged appropriately, with the word mercy on a piece of paper, a small courtesy. He provided me with his files on the matter, and his promise of continued silence. His death, I regret to say, was entirely natural. The stress of recent events, perhaps, combined with a weak heart. Most convenient for you, indeed. Which brings us to the current situation, Monsieur Poirot. You have learned a great deal in a very short time. The question now is what we do with that knowledge. She withdrew an envelope from her handbag, cream-coloured, of familiar quality. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but you've proven remarkably persistent. This envelope contains your invitation to join our small circle of discreet individuals. All you need do is acknowledge your understanding and agreement to leave the past where it belongs. Poirot examined the envelope without opening it. And if I decline your generous offer, then you'll discover that some collectors prize silence above all other treasures, and they're willing to pay any price to obtain it. At that moment the situation changed dramatically. Marcus Cornelius, whose nervousness had been building throughout the conversation, suddenly broke. "No," he shouted, abandoning his post at the door. "I won't be part of another murder. Bad enough what we did to Hartwell, but I won't watch you kill a famous detective in my shop." Lady Catherine turned on him with fury. "You fool, do you think he'll simply walk away and forget what he's learned? Better to take our chances with the law than add more blood to our hands." The confrontation between the two conspirators provided Poirot with the opportunity he needed. Moving with surprising agility for a man of his years, he darted toward the front of the shop while they argued. But Lady Catherine was quicker than her age suggested. She produced a small revolver from her handbag with practiced ease. "I'm afraid, Monsieur Poirot, that Mr. Cornelius's sudden attack of conscience has simply accelerated our timeline. You'll find that envelope contains not an invitation but a suicide note, one that confesses your guilt in these recent deaths and expresses your remorse at being discovered. Most thorough. But surely you don't expect anyone to believe that Hercule Poirot would take his own life out of guilt. Oh, but you won't be taking your own life, monsieur. You'll be the tragic victim of Mr. Cornelius here, who will be overcome with remorse at your murder, and turn the gun on himself. A murder-suicide between criminal associates, so much more believable than suicide alone." Cornelius stared at her in horror. "You're mad. I never agreed to." "You agreed when you took your share of the profits, Marcus. You agreed when you helped me dispose of the evidence. You agreed when you kept silent about Hartwell's death." The shop fell silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the wall, a sound that seemed to count down the seconds of Poirot's life. The revolver remained steady in Lady Catherine's hand, and her eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had killed before, and would do so again without hesitation. But Hercule Poirot had not survived this long by relying on luck alone. His hand moved toward his vest pocket with deliberate slowness. "Permit me, madame, to retrieve my watch. If I am to die, I should like to know the precise time. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Certainly. But I wonder, did you truly believe you could silence everyone who knew your secret? For instance, what of Mrs. Fairchild? Surely she too received one of your invitations." Lady Catherine's composure flickered for just an instant. Mrs. Fairchild proved reasonable. She understood that her husband's reputation was best preserved by leaving old scandals undisturbed. "Ah, but you are mistaken, madame. Mrs. Fairchild and I have already examined her late husband's files together. She knows everything about the gem thefts, about the conspiracy, about your threats to the other participants, and she is not alone in this knowledge. It was a bluff, but a calculated one." Poirot could see doubt creeping into Lady Catherine's eyes. "You're lying." "Am I? Tell me, how did you learn that Mr. Hartwell was considering breaking his silence? Someone must have informed you of his intentions." The question struck home. Lady Catherine's hand wavered slightly as she processed the implications. "Moreover," Poirot continued, "did you really believe that Inspector Morrison would not notice if I simply disappeared? Even now, he expects me to report to Scotland Yard. My absence will trigger immediate investigation." Before Lady Catherine could respond, the shop's front door burst open with a crash. Inspector Morrison himself appeared, followed by two constables, their presence filling the small space with sudden authority. "Drop the weapon, Lady Whitmore," Morrison commanded, his own revolver drawn and steady. The confrontation collapsed as quickly as it had escalated. Lady Catherine, faced with overwhelming odds, allowed her gun to fall from nerveless fingers. Marcus Cornelius sank into a chair, his face in his hands, mumbling incoherent confessions. "Excellent timing, mon ami," Poirot said to Morrison with evident relief. "Though I must ask, how did you know to find me here?" "Mrs. Fairchild," Morrison replied as his men secured the prisoners. "After you left her yesterday evening, she became concerned about the missing portrait and decided to examine more of her husband's papers. She found a list of names, people who had been involved in the India business. When she saw that both Hartwell and Dubois were on that list, she realized the pattern. She called the Yard immediately. And the other names on this list: Sir Reginald Ashworth was found dead in his library this morning, apparent heart failure, but we're treating it as suspicious now. Colonel Weatherby has been taken into protective custody, and Marcus Cornelius here was identified as Lady Catherine's business partner through financial records." As the prisoners were led away, Poirot reflected on the case's resolution. Lady Catherine maintained her composure even in defeat, but Marcus Cornelius was already babbling about locations where stolen gems might still be found, bank accounts in Switzerland, and other details of their long-running conspiracy. "A remarkable woman," Morrison observed as they watched the police carriage disappear down the street. "She might have gotten away with it entirely if she hadn't become so greedy for complete silence. Indeed, the original conspiracy was nearly perfect, a simple theft disguised as banditry, with profits shared among colonial officials who were above suspicion. But 30 years in London society had made her overconfident. She believed that her position and reputation made her untouchable. What triggered her decision to start silencing the witnesses now after all these years?" Poirot smiled thoughtfully. "I suspect we shall discover that someone, perhaps an insurance investigator or a journalist, had begun asking questions about those old gem shipments. Rather than risk exposure, she decided to eliminate anyone who could provide evidence of the conspiracy." As they walked back toward Scotland Yard, Poirot reflected on the tragic irony of the case. Edmund Hartwell had died not because he threatened to expose the conspiracy, but because Lady Catherine feared he might. Monsieur Dubois had cooperated fully, only to die of natural causes brought on by the stress of extortion. Sir Reginald Ashworth had apparently succumbed to fear before he could even respond to his invitation. The blank papers, Morrison mused, clever really. No explicit threats, nothing that could be used as evidence of extortion, but equally effective, Poirot replied. To those who understood their meaning, they were more terrifying than any written threat. They represented the weight of buried guilt, the fear of exposure, the price of complicity in crimes long past. The case of the envelopes sealed in silence was drawing to its close, but Poirot knew that its reverberations would continue for some time. There would be trials, revelations, and the painful exposure of corruption that had festered in secret for decades. Sometimes, he reflected, silence truly was golden, but the price of maintaining it could be higher than anyone imagined. Chapter 7: The Unraveling Truth. The interrogation of Marcus Cornelius at Scotland Yard proved to be a revelation. Once his initial terror subsided, the man became almost eager to confess, as if the burden of years of complicity had finally become too heavy to bear alone. It started so innocently, he told Poirot and Inspector Morrison as they sat in the austere interview room. I was just a junior clerk in the Calcutta Customs Office processing shipment documents. Lady Catherine, she was Mrs. Whitmore, then approached me about certain irregularities she had noticed. What sort of irregularities? Morrison prompted. Discrepancies between the gems being shipped and the manifest descriptions. Someone was already stealing from the shipments, replacing fine stones with inferior ones. She convinced me that we were simply correcting an injustice that was already occurring. Poirot leaned forward with interest. She was not the originator of the theft. Oh no, her husband Colonel Whitmore had discovered that gems were disappearing from shipments under his protection, but instead of reporting it, he decided to organize the operation properly. If theft is inevitable, he said, it should at least be profitable for the right people. The scope of the conspiracy, as Cornelius revealed it, was breathtaking in its audacity. Over nearly 2 years the group had systematically looted gem shipments worth millions of pounds. The stolen treasures were replaced with inferior stones or clever paste imitations, while fabricated reports of bandit attacks provided cover for the losses. Who else was involved? Morrison asked. Colonel Whitmore organized everything. Charles Fairchild handled the London end, ensuring that insurance claims were processed without too much scrutiny. Monsieur Dubois facilitated the French connection. Some of the stolen gems were sold through dealers in Paris. Sir Reginald Ashworth provided administrative cover, and I processed the false documentation. And Edmund Hartwell? Cornelius's face crumpled. Poor Hartwell. He stumbled onto our operation by accident through his meticulous record-keeping. When he started asking questions, Colonel Whitmore decided it was safer to bring him into the conspiracy than to silence him. Hartwell agreed to cooperate, but I think he regretted it immediately. Why did the operation end? Colonel Whitmore's death in 1922. Without his protection and organization, continuing would have been too dangerous. We agreed to maintain silence about our activities and divide the remaining proceeds. It seemed like the matter was closed forever, but Poirot was interested in more recent events. What changed, monsieur? Why did Lady Catherine decide to revive these old concerns? Cornelius shifted uncomfortably. About 2 months ago she received an inquiry from a journalist, someone writing a book about colonial corruption in India. He had found references to the gem thefts in old newspaper reports, and was asking questions about the investigation that was dropped, and this alarmed her, terrified her. She was convinced that if the story became public, someone would eventually connect her to the original conspiracy. She decided that anyone who could provide evidence of our activities was a liability. The picture that emerged was of a woman consumed by paranoia, seeing threats where none existed, and striking out at shadows from her past. Edmund Hartwell had probably never intended to break his silence. His renewed contact with the other conspirators had likely been motivated by the same journalists' inquiries, seeking to coordinate their responses. The blank papers, Poirot mused, whose idea were they? Hers entirely. She said they were more frightening than any explicit threat because they forced the recipients to confront their own guilt. A blank page could mean anything or nothing. The imagination would fill in the worst possibilities. Later that afternoon, Poirot and Morrison visited Lady Catherine in her cell. She had maintained her composure throughout her arrest and processing, sitting regally, even in the stark confines of police custody. "You have been busy, Monsieur Poirot," she observed as they entered. "I trust Mr. Cornelius has been suitably dramatic in his confessions." "He has been most informative, madame, though I suspect there are details he does not know."
Oh, there are many details Marcus never knew. He was always more useful than intelligent. For instance, the method by which you induced Miss Hartwell's death. Lady Catherine's eyes glittered with what might have been pride. Ah, you noticed that the autopsy found no cause. I was rather pleased with that accomplishment. Poison that leaves no trace. Nothing so crude. Tell me, Monsieur Poirot, what do you know of the Indian art of pranayama? Breathing exercises used in meditation and spiritual practice, among other things. During my years in India, I studied with several native practitioners. I learned that properly applied pressure to certain points on the neck could interrupt the breathing reflex, causing unconsciousness or even death without leaving obvious marks. Morrison stared at her in horror. You strangled him. I induced respiratory failure through pressure point manipulation, much more subtle than strangulation, and far more difficult to detect. Poor Mr. Hartwell received his blank envelope at his office, along with explicit instructions about what was expected of him. When he refused to cooperate, you visited him at his office, disguised as a cleaning woman during the evening hours when the building was largely empty. Security in government buildings was quite lax in those days. I simply waited until he worked late, as he had been doing regularly, and paid him a call. The casual way she described the murder chilled both listeners. This was not the passionate crime of someone driven to desperation, but the calculated action of someone who viewed human life as simply another obstacle to be removed. And Monsieur Dubois died of natural causes, exactly as reported. The stress of our negotiation, combined with his weak heart, proved fatal. I had hoped to avoid violence with him, and I succeeded. His cooperation was complete. Sir Reginald Ashworth. Also natural causes, though I suspect his heart gave out from fear rather than guilt. Some people simply cannot bear the weight of their own secrets. As they prepared to leave, Lady Catherine called after them. Tell me, Monsieur Poirot, what was it that convinced you to look beyond the obvious explanations? Poirot turned back to face her. The envelope found with Mr. Hartwell, madame. If he had died naturally while reading a blank page, his grip would have relaxed. But he clutched that envelope as if it were evidence, which indeed it was. His final act was to preserve proof of your contact with him. Clever man. I should have taken the envelope with me. But then there would have been no mystery for me to solve, and you would have escaped justice entirely. Lady Catherine smiled coldly. Justice, Monsieur Poirot. We took gems from a system that ground native peoples under British boots. We redistributed wealth that had been stolen from its rightful owners for centuries. What justice is there in protecting the profits of empire? Perhaps, Poirot replied quietly. The justice of ensuring that murder is never the answer to moral questions, however complex they may be. As they left the jail, Morrison shook his head in amazement. 30 years of freedom, built on theft and murder. She might have lived out her life in comfort if she hadn't become so paranoid. The guilty mind, mon ami, creates its own prison. Lady Catherine was never truly free. She was always looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with her. In the end, her fears became her reality. Chapter 8, The Weight of Secrets. The news of Lady Catherine Whitmore's arrest sent shockwaves through London society. The revelation that a respected widow, known for her charitable work and social connections, had been behind a series of murders connected to colonial-era gem thefts became the sensation of the season. Poirot found himself inundated with requests for interviews from journalists, invitations to social events where he would undoubtedly be pressed for details, and correspondence from various official bodies seeking clarification of the case's implications for other colonial-era investigations. He declined them all, preferring to focus on the human aftermath of the case. His first visit was to Mrs. Helena Fairchild, who had requested his assistance in deciding what to do with her late husband's extensive files. I feel as though I never really knew Charles, she confided as they sat in her drawing room, surrounded by boxes of documents. All these years I thought he was simply a dedicated public servant. To learn that he was involved in theft, even peripherally, Madame Poirot said gently, your husband's role appears to have been largely administrative. From what we have learned, he processed insurance claims without asking too many questions, a common practice in those days when colonial losses were frequent and investigations expensive. But he knew, didn't he? The files make it clear that he suspected what was happening. He suspected, yes, But suspicion and proof are different things, and when the conspiracy was exposed he chose to bury the evidence rather than pursue justice. Perhaps he felt that the damage was already done, that further investigation would hurt innocent people without recovering the stolen gems. Mrs. Fairchild picked up one of her husband's letters, dated shortly before his death. He writes here about the burden of knowledge and the price of silence. I think the secret ate away at him for 20 years, and yet he kept it, even when it clearly caused him suffering. That suggests a man of honor, even if his honor was misguided. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Eleanor Whitfield, Edmund Hartwell's former secretary. She had requested permission to attend their meeting, having her own questions about the case's resolution. I keep thinking about Mr. Hartwell's final weeks, she said after Miss Fairchild had briefed her on the discoveries. He seemed so burdened. Now I understand why. He must have been wrestling with whether to maintain his silence or speak out. What decided him, do you think? Mrs. Fairchild asked. Poirot considered the question carefully. I believe it was the journalist's inquiry that changed everything. Suddenly Mr. Hartwell realized that the secret might come out regardless of his cooperation. He faced a choice: maintain his silence and risk being exposed as a conspirator, or speak first and control the narrative. So he contacted the others to coordinate their response. Yes, but Lady Catherine saw any contact between the conspirators as a threat to her security. She had spent 30 years building a respectable life on the foundation of stolen wealth. She would not allow that foundation to be examined too closely. Miss Whitfield shuddered. To think that she killed him just for wanting to do the right thing. The irony, Poirot observed, is that Mr. Hartwell's death ensured that the very exposure Lady Catherine feared would occur. Had she simply let events unfold naturally, the journalist might have found insufficient evidence to write his story. The original investigation was closed precisely because the evidence was ambiguous. That afternoon Poirot visited Colonel James Weatherby, who remained in protective custody at a safe house while authorities determined whether Lady Catherine might have accomplices still at large. Weatherby was a broken man, aged beyond his years by the weight of guilt and fear. When Poirot arrived, he found the colonel staring out a window at the London street below, seeming to watch for threats that might never come. "She's really gone, isn't she?" Weatherby asked without turning around. "Catherine, I mean, arrested, charged, finished." "Completely finished, mon colonel. She will face trial for multiple murders." "Good. God help me, but I'm glad. I've been afraid of that woman for 20 years. Weatherby's story filled in details that even Marcus Cornelius hadn't known. As the military officer responsible for protecting gem shipments, he had been perfectly positioned to observe the systematic thefts. When Colonel Whitmore approached him about joining the conspiracy, he had refused initially. "But then my gambling debts caught up with me," he explained bitterly. "I owed money to people who weren't particularly patient about collection. Whitmore offered me a way out. One lost shipment would clear my debts entirely, and once you had participated, I was trapped. One theft led to another, and another. By the time I realized how deep we were in, there was no way out. When Whitmore died, and we all agreed to maintain silence, I thought it was finally over. But Lady Catherine never let you forget your participation. She reminded me regularly that my comfortable retirement depended on her continued goodwill. A word from her to the authorities, and I would spend my final years in prison. She used that leverage to encourage my cooperation in various matters over the years." "What sort of matters?" "Small things, mostly. Introductions to people she wanted to meet, recommendations for business opportunities, occasional character references. Nothing illegal, but always with the understanding that I owed her my freedom." Poirot reflected on the insidious nature of blackmail, how it created relationships based on fear rather than trust, how it corrupted even innocent interactions with the shadow of coercion. "When did you last see Lady Catherine?" 3 weeks ago. She visited to inform me that old questions were being asked, and that I should be prepared to maintain our agreed-upon silence. She seemed different, more intense, more dangerous than I remembered. "You feared her." "I was terrified of her. When I read about Hartwell's death, I suspected immediately that Catherine was involved. When Dubois died as well," he shrugged helplessly, "I knew I would be next." The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. The journalist whose inquiry had triggered Lady Catherine's murderous campaign. Jonathan Blackwood was a freelance writer specializing in colonial history, and his research into Indian corruption cases had uncovered references to the gem thefts that were subsequently covered up. "I never meant to cause anyone harm," he told Poirot when they met at a coffee house near the British Museum. "I was simply trying to write a comprehensive account of economic irregularities during the colonial period. The gem thefts were just one chapter in a much larger story." "What led you to investigate that particular case?" "Insurance records, mainly. I noticed patterns in claims for losses to bandits, too many valuable shipments disappearing in too convenient circumstances. When I tried to research the official investigations, I found that most of the files had been sealed or destroyed." "And you contacted the surviving participants?" "I sent letters to several people who had been mentioned in the original reports. Most never responded, but one, I think it was Mr. Hartwell, sent back a note saying that he might be willing to discuss the matter if I could demonstrate that my intentions were scholarly rather than sensational." Blackwood's innocent academic inquiry had set in motion the chain of events that led to 3 deaths and the exposure of a 30-year-old conspiracy. It was a sobering reminder of how the past could reach into the present with devastating consequences. "I've decided to abandon the book project," Blackwood concluded. "The cost in human life is too high for any historical revelation." Poirot nodded sympathetically, but privately disagreed. "The truth, however painful, was always preferable to lies built on graves. The real tragedy was not that the conspiracy had been exposed, but that it had been allowed to fester in darkness for so many years, poisoning every life it touched." Chapter 9, Justice and Judgment. The trial of Lady Catherine Whitmore began on a grey January morning at the Old Bailey, drawing crowds of spectators eager to witness the downfall of a woman who had fooled London society for decades. Poirot attended as a key witness, though he took no pleasure in the proceedings. The prosecution, led by Sir William Hartley, painted a picture of calculated evil spanning 3 decades. Lady Catherine, they argued, had transformed from an opportunistic thief into a cold-blooded killer, silencing anyone who threatened her carefully constructed facade of respectability. "Members of the jury," Sir William declared in his opening statement, "you will hear evidence of a conspiracy that robbed the British Empire of millions of pounds worth of precious gems. But more importantly, you will learn how the defendant murdered Edmund Hartwell, an innocent civil servant, whose only crime was developing a conscience about past misdeeds." Lady Catherine's defense counsel, Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton QC, faced an almost impossible task. His client had confessed to multiple murders during her interrogation, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. His strategy, therefore, focused on mitigation rather than denial. "My client was a young woman swept into a criminal conspiracy by her late husband," he argued. "For 30 years she lived with the knowledge of these crimes, until fear of exposure drove her to desperate actions. We ask the court to consider the circumstances that led to these tragic events." Marcus Cornelius was the prosecution's first witness, his testimony providing the foundation for understanding the original conspiracy. He appeared dramatically aged by his ordeal, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper as he recounted the systematic looting of gem shipments. "It seemed so simple at first," he said, avoiding eye contact with Lady Catherine. "Just a few stones here and there, replaced with inferior gems. We told ourselves we weren't really stealing, just redistributing wealth that rightfully belonged to us." Under cross-examination, Pemberton tried to portray Cornelius as an unreliable witness motivated by his own desire to minimize his culpability. But the man's obvious remorse and detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's operations made his testimony devastatingly effective. Colonel Weatherby followed, his military bearing unable to disguise the shame that consumed him. His account of how financial desperation had led him into the conspiracy provided context for the pressure that had driven respectable people to crime. "I want the court to understand," he said, his voice breaking, "that Lady Catherine was not the primary architect of these crimes. That was her husband, Colonel Whitmore. But she never forgot. She used our shared guilt to control us for 30 years. Mrs. Helena Fairchild's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense. Her revelation of the extensive files her late husband had kept, documenting the conspiracy's activities, demolished any hope of portraying the crimes as minor irregularities rather than systematic theft. "Charles kept meticulous records," she explained, "because he knew that someday the truth would come out. He was prepared to face the consequences of his actions, but he wanted the complete picture to be available when that time came.
When Poirot took the stand, he provided the methodical detective work that had unravelled Lady Catherine's web of murders. His testimony was precise, professional, and devastating in its implications. The defendant's methods, he explained to the jury, demonstrated both premeditation and sophisticated knowledge of techniques that would leave no obvious evidence. Mr. Hartwell's death was not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution designed to simulate natural causes. Under cross-examination, Pemberton attempted to suggest that Poirot's foreign background might have led him to misunderstand certain aspects of British colonial administration. The attack backfired spectacularly when Poirot calmly dismantled the lawyer's understanding of the evidence with characteristic precision. "I fear, mon ami," Poirot said with devastating politeness, "that you miscomprehend both the facts of this case and the methods by which they were discovered. Perhaps you would prefer that I explain the process more slowly." The courtroom erupted in laughter, and Pemberton wisely chose not to pursue that line of questioning further. Dr. Pemberton, the police surgeon, testified about the unusual circumstances of Hartwell's death and how Lady Catherine's confession had finally explained the absence of any apparent cause. "In 40 years of forensic medicine," he stated, "I have never encountered a case where the cause of death was so successfully concealed." The defendant's knowledge of pressure point techniques was clearly extensive and expertly applied. The most dramatic moment came when Lady Catherine herself took the stand. Against her counsel's advice, she insisted on testifying, apparently believing she could charm the jury as she had charmed London society for decades. She was magnificently defiant, showing no remorse for her actions, and maintaining that she had been justified in protecting herself from exposure. "I lived for 30 years with the knowledge that one word from any of my former associates could destroy everything I had built," she declared. "When Mr. Hartwell decided to break his silence, he forced my hand. I did what was necessary to protect myself. Even if it meant murder," Sir William pressed, "even if it meant removing a threat to my security, yes." Her cold admission of guilt without remorse horrified the courtroom. Here was a woman who saw human life as merely an obstacle to be removed when convenient. Under Pemberton's examination, she attempted to portray herself as a victim of circumstances, driven to desperate measures by fear and desperation. But her earlier testimony had already revealed her true character, and the jury was clearly unmoved by her appeals for sympathy. The trial's conclusion was swift and decisive. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. The judge, Mr. Justice Whitmore, no relation to the defendant, delivered his sentence with stern finality. "Lady Catherine Whitmore," he intoned, "you have been found guilty of the most serious crimes known to our law. Your actions demonstrate a callous disregard for human life and a calculated cruelty that this court cannot tolerate. I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until dead." The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was pronounced. Lady Catherine received it without visible emotion, maintaining her composure even in the face of ultimate justice. As the crowd dispersed, Poirot reflected on the case's resolution. Justice had been served, but at a terrible cost. 3 innocent men had died, families had been destroyed, and the revelation of colonial-era corruption had tarnished reputations that had been built over decades of subsequent honest service. "A Pyrrhic victory," Inspector Morrison observed as they left the courthouse together. "Perhaps," Poirot replied. "But sometimes the truth demands such prices. Better that these secrets should die with their revelation than continue to poison new generations with their weight." Chapter 10: The Final Silence. The weeks following Lady Catherine Whitmore's conviction brought a peculiar kind of peace to London. The sensation of the trial gradually faded from newspaper headlines, replaced by other scandals and fresher mysteries. But for those intimately connected with the case, the aftermath proved more complex than simple relief at justice served. Poirot made it his business to visit each of the surviving participants, ensuring that the truth's revelation had not left them more damaged than the original deception. Mrs. Helena Fairchild had surprised everyone by her resilience. rather than being destroyed by the revelation of her husband's involvement in the gem conspiracy. She had found a curious kind of liberation in finally understanding the burden he had carried. "I always wondered why Charles seemed so troubled in his later years," she told Poirot during one of his visits to her Kensington home. "Now I understand that he was wrestling with his conscience, trying to find a way to make amends for his youthful mistake." She had decided to use her husband's detailed files to assist government investigators in tracking down remaining stolen gems and identifying other victims of the conspiracy. Several valuable stones had already been recovered from Lady Catherine's various hiding places, and efforts were underway to return them to their rightful owners or their descendants. Charles kept such meticulous records, she explained, because he hoped that someday the wrongs could be righted. "I consider it my duty to complete that work." Colonel Weatherby had not fared as well. The stress of the trial, combined with years of suppressed guilt, had broken his health completely. He remained in a private nursing facility, his mind increasingly clouded by what his doctors diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion. When Poirot visited him, the colonel seemed to recognize him only intermittently, speaking sometimes as if the events in India had occurred just yesterday, rather than 30 years ago. "She's coming back, you know," he whispered during one lucid moment. "Catherine, she'll never let us rest. The dead never do." Poirot gently corrected him, explaining that Lady Catherine would never threaten anyone again, but the old soldier's damaged mind could not accept this reassurance. He had lived in fear for so long that peace felt impossible. Marcus Cornelius had responded to his role in exposing the conspiracy by dedicating himself to making what amends he could. He had liquidated his entire gem collection, donating the proceeds to charities that supported orphans and widows in India, attempting, in his own words, to return something to those we robbed. "I can never undo what I did," he told Poirot, "but perhaps I can prevent some of the suffering our greed caused." The journalist Jonathan Blackwood had indeed abandoned his book project, but his research had opened other avenues of investigation. Government auditors were now examining colonial-era records more systematically, looking for patterns of corruption that might have escaped notice at the time. "Your case has become a template," he informed Poirot. "Investigators are learning to look for the same signs that led you to uncover Lady Catherine's crimes." The revelation of the conspiracy had also prompted changes in how colonial records were preserved and studied. The ease with which the original investigation had been buried and its files destroyed had appalled modern administrators, leading to new policies ensuring that historical evidence would be preserved for future examination. 3 months after the trial, Poirot received an unexpected visitor, Timothy Ashford, the young clerk who had first discovered Edmund Hartwell's body. The young man had been profoundly affected by learning the truth behind his colleague's death. "I keep thinking about Mr. Hartwell," he said as they sat in Poirot's modest lodgings. "He seemed like such an ordinary man, but he was carrying this extraordinary secret. It makes me wonder what other people around us might be hiding." "That way lies madness, mon ami," Poirot warned gently. "Most people's secrets are far more mundane than you might imagine. Mr. Hartwell was unusual precisely because his burden was so exceptional. But how do we know? How can we tell who among us might be more than they appear?" It was a profound question, one that spoke to the deeper implications of the case. Lady Catherine had hidden her true nature behind decades of respectability, charity work, and social prominence. If someone so apparently admirable could conceal such darkness, who could truly be trusted? "We cannot know with certainty," Poirot admitted. "But we can choose to believe in the fundamental decency of most people while remaining alert to signs that our trust might be misplaced. The alternative, suspecting everyone, leads only to paranoia and isolation." On a warm spring morning in April, Poirot made a final pilgrimage to Kensal Green Cemetery, where Edmund Hartwell had been laid to rest. The modest gravestone bore only his name, dates, and the simple inscription, "A faithful servant." No mention was made of the circumstances of his death or the secrets he had carried. As Poirot stood beside the grave, he reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought this quiet civil servant into his orbit. Hartwell had lived an unremarkable life until the very end, when his belated attempt to follow his conscience had led to his murder. Perhaps, Poirot murmured to the stone, your death served a purpose after all, mon ami. The truth you died trying to reveal has finally seen the light. A nearby grave caught his attention, a newer stone bearing the name Reginald Ashworth and recent dates. Sir Reginald had been buried here just days after Lady Catherine's arrest, his heart finally giving out under the strain of approaching exposure. Even in death, the conspiracy's victims continued to accumulate. That evening, as he prepared his final report on the case for Inspector Morrison, Poirot considered the broader lessons of the affair. The envelope sealed in silence had contained no written message because none was needed. The blank paper had spoken eloquently of guilt, fear, and the terrible weight of buried secrets. Lady Catherine Whitmore had been executed the previous week, maintaining her defiant composure to the end. Her final words, according to the chaplain, had been not of remorse but of anger at being betrayed by cowards who lacked the courage to see their commitments through. Even in death, she remained unrepentant. The case files would eventually be sealed and stored in Scotland Yard's archives, but its impact would resonate for years to come. New procedures for investigating historical corruption, better preservation of colonial records, improved methods for detecting pressure point homicides, all would emerge from the lessons learned during this investigation. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler, that silence, however golden it might appear, could never truly bury the truth. Secrets had weight, and eventually that weight became too much for even the strongest to bear. As Poirot sealed his final report and prepared to turn his attention to other mysteries, he reflected that justice, like truth, had its own inexorable logic. It might be delayed, complicated or disguised, but it would ultimately prevail. The envelope sealed in silence had finally been opened, its message read and understood. The voices of the dead had been heard, and their stories told. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest justice of all, ensuring that those who had died for the truth had not died in vain. And so concludes our tale from the files of Hercule Poirot. The envelope sealed in silence reminds us that some mysteries begin not with what is written, but with what is deliberately left blank, and that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are those we carry within ourselves. As Poirot himself observed in his final notes on the case, the human heart is the greatest mystery of all, capable of both extraordinary evil and unexpected redemption. We must never cease to be amazed by either. The case would be remembered not just for its ingenious solution, but for the questions it raised about justice, redemption, and the price we pay for our past mistakes. Edmund Hartwell's death had seemed senseless at first, a man clutching a blank piece of paper, apparently dying of no discernible cause, but in the end, that blank paper had spoken volumes about guilt, fear, and the terrible weight of buried truth. Lady Catherine Whitmore had believed she could silence the past through murder, but she had only ensured that it would speak all the louder. Her victims, Hartwell, Dubois and Ashworth, had found their voices in death, their stories finally told through the patient work of a Belgian detective who understood that every mystery, no matter how complex, contained its own solution. The envelope sealed in silence had finally been opened. Its message, though written in invisible ink of guilt and fear, had been read at last. And in that reading, justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the voices of the dead had finally been heard.